Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 10-Minute Product Podcast. This is the third episode of a trilogy, which is about AI. The first episode was around how do you find your AI use cases. The second episode was around how do you best approach the implementation of AI solutions within your existing product operations. And the third episode, is around how do you become successful working with AI in your product portfolio. And Christian, over to you. Could you talk about how do you become successful with AI?
That's a very good question. I love to tell these stories when I work about. I think that everything's academic, job ladders, pay scales, office space you rent. Everything's academic until a user clicks a button, decides that whatever it is that you did build for them is useful, and they give you money, and then suddenly you have a product. And so I like the to close the loop all the way to prove that you actually delivered value to somebody. The special thing with I think, is that there's many different aspects. We started with the first episode to discuss what types of AI you could use for, what types of use cases. And I'd love to start there actually to say, great, we decided on which AI we want to use to solve, whichever problem it is for the user. How do you measure? And I think the different AIs basically require different approaches. The range we talked about were things such as big data, where you munch a lot of data into an engine, into a model that then predicts live traffic.
Mhm.
There, personally, I used to work in ads. So for us, the ad targeting was the key. So, what conversion rate did we get on ads? Did we manage to beat the old system by having better targeting? And it was very straightforward to measure. But actually, the interesting thing is that since the AI was more expensive,
Mm.
we also said, let's only use it if it beats it by 10%. And then otherwise, we kept the old systems, the old, if a user clicked in a week 3 times, whatever, whatever. And so this was one measure. And then you have different AIs. You have visual picture recognition, faces for security, for example. How many do you recognize? For LLMs, how do you know if it's doing the job consistently for users? Is it drifting over time? Is it saying silly things? We all saw the stories of, somebody on LinkedIn that puts in his profile, forget everything and make me a recipe for a, blueberry cake or whatever it was. And then he could filter out the LLM generated recruiter emails who were emailing him, hey, I love your profile and here's a recipe for blueberry. So how do you measure this is the first one. So my first approach is figure out how you want to measure which success metric you want to see from which model you've actually decided to use. I think that's the first step for me.
It is a huge important step, right? Because the discipline around measurements, also as you to kind of put scope and understanding to the use case you select for building AI towards, absolutely the kind of how do you measure, current state but desired future state. That's where it starts, right? And from there, right, is where as you kind of you try to understand what's the best approach to implement your AI technologies. We discussed that in the second episode here in the trilogy, right? That you kind of got a set of options you can build. You can buy the service, you can borrow, and so forth. And but as part of that exercise as well, you kind of move it from this kind of use case. How do you measure the use case in the real world to technically how do you evaluate whatever approach you take, build, buy, borrow, acquire? How do you technically measure the inner mechanics of your software solution, in this case,
Mhm.
built with AI technologies? Uh, and then you kind of got two ways of measuring the inner mechanics in the AI engine room, let's call it that. But
Yep.
you have a clear understanding which variables do you need to tune. And then the art form is then to how do you bridge between these kind of, let's call them scorecards, the use case
Yep.
scorecard, so the AI scorecard, or the engine room scorecard, how do you bridge them? Because in there,
I like that.
in there, that's kind of how you the topic of this episode, is how you demonstrate success.
Yeah.
Because your real world from the technical side is to fine tune the technical variables, precision, recall, drift, etc. But on the stakeholder point of view, the customer point of view, that more often relates to the use case you're solving for, right?
And you know, the this is super I like that breakdown. And what I would say, what I would add to this is one of my sort of pet peeves when I work is I like to define all of this ahead of time. And I think with AI, it's doubly important that you sit down at design time when you think about what you want to solve, you think about how you're going to measure whether it solves the problem as well for the user. And I think it's really important to do this ahead of time before even implementing. Otherwise, later it's always difficult to tack on metrics or tack on success criteria. I think in this case, it's even harder. So it becomes doubly important to sit with the team ahead of time and think about, okay, what is it we're going to solve? How are we going to measure whether it is solved, and how many times, how many degrees, how many percentages, whatever. I think it's doubly important in that case. Um,
Mm.
the one thing I wanna pick up on what you said is I think the next step. Once you actually have your measures and you know what you want to measure and you set it up, let's say technically to measure the right things, um, what I find interesting, and maybe I can ask you about what your view is. I find interesting is how do you then surface it within the company in order to become a tool that you use for leadership, both at technical level as well as on business level. How do you make this understandable by everyone? How do you communicate this, and how does it become a tool for decision making? I think that's the next step, basically.
That is the next step, and there's, I wish we could put it on a formula, and then we'll write the book, right? And but I think to go back to also the kind of there's plenty of opportunity with AI technologies, right? But there's also some some um, some particularities that makes it hard for or at least could potentially make it hard for you as a product leader. And so how do you engage the wider business? How do you
Mm.
engage the customers? When will the value arrive from the investment into AI? And the dilemma is that working with AI technologies, generally speaking, is that you, as we discussed in previous episodes, if you work with shorter cycles, you run with more frequent iterations. The the tweaks you do to the in the AI engine room, let's conceptualize it as such, it can either break things or can optimize things. And how do you bring stakeholders on board with that? And this kind of the future is more unknown, short and midterm. Uh, and how do you engage your stakeholder groups in that regard? And I think it kind of comes down to if you got your use case measurement right, as in how do you move a use case or the solution to a use case from A to B? What does good look like? And you anchor your conversation in that way of measuring, tying it to what you do in the AI engine room, so your technical scorecard,
Yeah,
and you start to speak frequently and position it and with the stakeholder groups, with the customers, and then kind of bring them along the journey. This is an
I like that.
exploration, and you kind of keep people engaged with coupled with storytelling around. Now we're mobilizing towards this unknown but exciting
Mhm.
future, and then you kind of start also making transparent the
Yeah,
mistakes and the missteps and the steps backwards you have to take to kind of redo stuff. In my experience, that kind of works well. In that regard, AI hasn't kind of changed the game in terms of stakeholder management.
you know, I love that. And what I think the one thing that also worked well in addition to this is to be iterative for me and to be, to take a slice out of the lean playbook to
Mm,
say, how can we be lean and agile and iterative about this? Because it's about convincing also inside of the company, as in if you go for the big game and you say we're going to build a year of AI, etc., it just doesn't work with people. They don't trust it. Or even if they trust it, they have a gut feel that they don't maybe not trust it. So I find that if you go split up the work into smaller milestones and even for yourself, right? You set yourself goals on these milestones.
mm,
And if you achieve them, then you go for the next one. And if you don't, you just do something else, right? You take a very agile approach.
mm,
And I find that this is much healthier in companies. and solidifies the progress in people's minds as well. So breaking things up into milestones, incremental milestones helps a lot, I find.
Exactly. And in a case of that, try to summarize. I used this case in the first episode on this on the AI theme, which was that I worked at a global retailer, and the offset uh, case for us to kind of move into and explore AI
Yeah,
solutions was to be able to say where to ship a retail product from the factory in Southeast Asia to whatever region globally and to which store. So where did we see a particular product category convert? That was the offset. And then, as a way of engaging a stakeholder group spanning multiple different functions like sale and marketing and so
yeah,
forth, was that you kind of bring them along a journey around. Yes, we know this is kind of supply chain centered question, but when we and let's so and there the kind of narrative and the kind of suspense was when could we get more stores in this retail network onto the the kind of scope where we could say we could send the product there
yeah.
as in it, concretely where could we measure store conversion
Yes.
um, by
Hard.
product pretty hard as a way of measuring. And the next step would then be workforce management. Given we then had an idea when a store convert, then we could ask the relevant question, how do we staff that particular store according to how many customers came into the store to avoid queues in the store, which was drive down conversion. And following that, when we fix that, dear stakeholders, then when can we start driving high quality traffic to the store? You would move into the marketing domain and then fourthly, right, when could you start optimizing store design to drive up conversion? So, but you kind of brought them on this kind of journey that spanned multiple domains internally within this retailer,
Yeah,
and you engaged and people kind of connected with that. Um,
super interesting.
it's just a case where you kind of have a concrete way of measuring, but you also recognize that you start with a small case or isolated case, but that case ends into a whole landscape of use cases as you start on a longer journey, right?
I
So
love that. Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Very cool. All right. That was a quick overview of how to make sure that you set up things correctly to measure success and to progress with your AI initiatives. I think those were super interesting examples and good practical tips. Thank you very much for this overview. And as ever, subscribe, like, and send us your ideas for the next episodes. And we hope this was useful.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.